TorahCafe.com.
So we're all familiar with Bereshit, Genesis. And just to remind you of the timeline of the Torah, God, as we've heard from many speakers, Rabbi Friedmann, begins from nothing, goes through the 6 days of creation. Adam is created in day 6. And our Jewish calendar, Rosh Hashanah, starts from there. So the biblical timeline is the 6 days of creation, and then the 5,777 years so far. So when we read Genesis, everything that happened in those 6 days, which is the whole creation of the universe and life on earth, occurred 5,777 years ago. Now it turns out that a couple of hundred years ago, geologists in Britain were doing what geologists do, which is to dig around and look for fossils and rocks and so on. And they started discovering, we'll get to it later how, that these rocks were quite a bit older than 6,000 years. And in fact, the most famous people working on this were actually priests, because the universities in England were controlled by the church at the time. They were believers in Genesis. They don't have the same calendar as we do. They're a little out by a few years, but they're still in the 6,000 to 10,000 years. So they began uncovering that things might be quite a bit older than in Genesis. And that began the issue. Over time, until today, those dates have been refined, and what science has come up with is some very big numbers. They've come up with an age for the universe, which is counting from the beginning till now, of 13.8 billion years. They've come up with the sun at 4.5 billion years, and even humans at 200,000 years. Now, these numbers are quite modern, but the magnitude of the numbers became known very quickly 200 years ago, and we had this discrepancy. Where the story went from there was that science developed an alternative to the Torah that says that God created everything, and that alternative was that it happened naturally. The universe happened naturally, life happened naturally, and the theory of a Big Bang and evolution were developed. And that's where I come into the story, because I've been in the space business for 37 years, and everybody thinks that since I go to shul on Saturday and they call it go to space on Monday, but I don't go anywhere to space on Monday, I just stay around here, that I should have the answer to this problem. So when the next generation of my family went through the school system, didn't matter whether it's a secular school or a frum school, they still teach. If they want to get any kind of help from the government at all, in most countries they still teach the science curriculum, which is very different to the science curriculum I was exposed to. I went to school and I learned how things worked. I learned how the lights worked, I learned how genes work. But today they teach evolution and the Big Bang. And they teach us as it's the only thing. So began searching for those, a better explanation that's out there. You may or may not know, but in the United States, they carry out a poll every year of the general population, the Pew Research poll, that asks 3 simple questions that kind of put you on one side of this argument or the other, depending on how you answer those questions. And in the last 5 years, for the first time in history, the 17 to 25 age group is answering different from the 50 to 60, 50 and up range. So the first time there's a generational gap. The younger crowd is answering the answers on the science side, and the older crowd on the Bible side. That's not a Jewish poll, it's a general poll. But as we know, the U.S. is a very religious country in general. So what I'd like to do with you today is to stick to this issue of what happened and when it happened, and try to get through that and return to the how. Was it God or was it natural, which we're teaching to our kids at the end? Because if you can't agree on some of the basic facts, then it's very hard to start having an argument about how it happened. And in fact, there's hundreds and hundreds of books out there, and neither side has seemed to have convinced the other side yet. So I'm going to spend a minute on science, and then we're going to switch to Torah for the rest of the time. And I'm going to spend a minute on science to do two things. First of all, to convince you not to dismiss it, which is one of the answers. Science is wrong. It doesn't work on the kids I talk to. And also to try and explain what we know and what we don't know. So the way we study and get these dates is we do two things. We look at the history of the universe through telescopes, the most famous telescope, of course, being the Hubble Space Telescope, which is in space, which my company actually worked on. And it did kind of inspire me to keep looking further as I talked to those people that were working there. And the other way is to look at the buried remains we have found on Earth. We've unearthed hundreds of thousands of fossils, anything from full dinosaur bones that I'm sure you've seen in museums, to teeth, to hair, to artifacts, to paintings, all kinds of things. So not just skeletons, but many other things. And in fact, we've unearthed many things for which DNA is preserved. It turns out that in some circumstances, DNA is preserved for 50,000 years. So we're able to take DNA samples of things that we unearth, animals and other things. Now, the important thing to realize is that these things are all about measuring. We are measuring what's going on out there, and that's very different from a theory to explain the measurements. So we have a bunch of bones, and we can see those bones, and we can understand how old they might be or where they might be found and so on. But to go from there to a theory of how they got there, that's a completely different story. I want to deal with the bones. The bones are there. I just saw them a few weeks ago in the Rockies, the Canadian Rockies. There's a whole mountain full of bones, buried things in the sea way back that have been risen up into the mountains. And leave the theories till later. When it comes to cosmology, what we have is starlight that we see. And I'm sure you've noticed when you see a CNN interview across the globe, or when you talk to somebody in Israel, that it takes about a second for the signal to get there. It's a little bit awkward when you're talking on the phone. That's because it takes light about a second to travel halfway around the world, because it has a finite speed. So when we look at the sun outside, that's looking back 8 minutes. That light that you see from the sun through the window here left 8 minutes ago. And thus, with telescopes, we can look back in time. We can see galaxies where the light left a long, long time ago. So through these processes, science has determined the dates that I showed you on the previous diagram. Now, we'll get later to, are they real dates or are they not real dates? Nonetheless, they're measuring these things, and they're measuring them consistently. And that's the issue for us. So we believe that the Torah is the blueprint for creation, that the Torah pre-existed Bereshit, that God looked into the Torah and He made the world. And therefore, from a scientist's point of view at least, you can't have that slide I showed you a little while back. Something's got to fit. The blueprint has to fit the creation. So what I want to do was to look and see what do we know about the timeline. Of course, we've all read Genesis. It says in day 1 this happened, in day 2, day 3, day 4. But that's pretty general. And you're all, of course, aware that we have the oral Torah to go with the written Torah. And when you look through the oral Torah, you find hundreds of pages on this topic. And you find quite a bit of information on time. And I just brought you a few examples to give you a taste. So in the Talmud, for example, we have an hour-by-hour description of day 6. You may recall that day 6 was a very busy day. The land animals were done, and of course Adam was made, and then the whole story of the Garden of Eden happened in day 6. So although Genesis will tell us that in the right order, the Talmud now goes and tells us what happened every hour. In the first hour, God gathered Adam's dust. By the fifth hour, he breathed the soul into him. In the sixth hour, he named the animals. And then he got split into Adam and Eve. And they had Cain and Abel. Then they were commanded. Then they sinned, judged, expelled. 12 hours. Tells us what happened in the 12 hours. If you go further to sources like the Midrash, there are many amazing statements. My favorite I brought here from Pirkei Rabbi Eliezer. We know that the sun and the moon were made and completed in terms of hanging to their orbits at the end of day 4. But, they went down exactly at the same time. Well, the Midrash says that the moon was completed within 2/3 of an hour after the sun. Now, that's a dangerous statement to state a long time ago on it. So we have all this information. We actually know that Adam sinned exactly 3 hours before Shabbos, at the end of the 9th hour. And so on. And in Hasidut, of course, we have tremendous information about how God created the world, and so on. So the first thing to understand is that the criticism I get is that the Genesis is less than the introduction of the first chapter of the science book. The Torah, of course, is a manual for life, not a science book, but for whatever reason God chose, through the combination of the written and the oral Torah, to give us several hundred pages, and that's just what I've discovered. I'm sure there's more than that, with a fair amount of information. So you can take all of these sources and you can create our own timeline. Not to the day, often to the minute. We can say what happened and when it happened. We can say that the moon was 2/3 of an hour after the sun. We can say that Adam sinned in the 9th hour, at the end of the 9th hour, not on the 6th day, but at the end of the 9th hour on day 6. And we can create a timeline, and I did this. I found about 17 events I could extract. Now, if we got a few rabbis in the room together, we probably agree on about 8 of those and the timing, because there's some disagreements about the timing of some of them. But on 8, we wouldn't have too much disagreement. We know when the beginning was, and we know when today is, for example, for the age of the universe. On the other ones, there might be more than one opinion, but it's pretty clear where most of the rulings are. And I laid out that timeline. And then I got back to the quote at the bottom of the slide, that God looked into the Torah and created the world. So what's going on? So I went to look if the Torah is the blueprint. I'm looking from this audience. I'm pretty sure everybody knows what a blueprint is. Sometimes when I speak to kids, they say, a blue what? But in the blueprint of my house, on the lower right-hand corner, it says that 4 feet is 1 inch. Now, I was blessed enough that my bar mitzvah parsha was Bereshit, and I know that it's not on the right-hand corner what the scale is from way back then. So I had to look for the scale somewhere else. What is this scale? Now, Friedmann explained this a lot better yesterday, but for those of you that weren't at his lecture, we attribute a whole number of physical characteristics to God. Took us out of Egypt from an outstretched arm. He spoke the world into existence. These are not an arm like mine or the words I'm saying. These are the real thing. The Torah is the real thing. The Torah is the truth. We are the analogy. So if we want to understand what that might mean, we could look at ourselves. So when it says that God spoke, we can look at our speech, and our speech is a process of taking a fairly infinite idea that's flying around my head at 1,000 miles an hour, putting it down in a sequential, fixed manner so that you can understand it, hopefully, as we go along. And that's exactly the Kabbalistic, the way in Kabbalah is described the creation of the world, of God constructing his infinity to make something finite in a sequential way, as, of course, as we see through Genesis. So if speaking is the real thing and what we are is the analogy, maybe a creation day is the real thing and our day is an analogy. And we have to dig deeper to understand what a day might be. Now, most people, when they say that, they say, okay, well, a day is a long period of time. And there's a problem with that, in that almost all our sources disagree with that. Our sources say that a day is 24 hours. and the creation days were 6 days, and in particular the Rebbe says that. So the other solution to the problem is that things were made old. So on any particular day, when things were made, they were already made in their finished state. In fact, we're told, right in Genesis, and we're told in the Midrash, but it's obvious from Genesis that Adam was made as a grown human, not as a baby. And we're told in the Midrash he was made as a 20-year-old. So had a doctor showed up a minute after he'd been made from the future and done a physical exam on him, the doctor would have concluded that Adam was 20 years old, and Adam would have had a laughing fit saying, I've just been around for about a minute. But the doctor only had the instruments he had to be able to determine that. So it could have been made old. But my problem still remains. If it was made old, the blueprint has to tell me how old to make it. I don't know if you've had the experience of one of your children arriving home with a brand new pair of jeans that looks really old. It's faded, maybe even be ripped, and proceed to have an argument of why they spend so much money on a pair of old jeans only to hear that they're brand new. So if you had one of these jean factories and you knew exactly how to make jeans look old, which is a scientific process, just wash them so many times, and that's roughly how you determine its age. And on Sunday you made jeans that were 6 years old, and that looked 6 years old, and on Monday you made jeans that look 5 years old, and so on. On Friday you make jeans that look 1 year old. Somebody shows up the next Sunday, he says, boy, you've been hard at work for 6 years. I said, are you kidding? That's just 6 days. I just got all that done last year. The difference between the two of them is one is using an analytical method to try and determine the age and is measuring something real, and the other one has an eyewitness account. He was there during the 6 days when he made the jeans. So we have the eyewitness account. And from a scientific point of view, we're only going back and trying to measure something. Nonetheless, the guy that's making those jeans knows exactly how many washes to put the 6-year-old jeans through versus the 5-year-old jeans through. So the blueprint, the Torah, has to tell us how old it should be made. And we should be able to get an agreement. So I went looking for that. I went looking for where is the knowledge of how old should things be made on the first day, on the second day, on the third day, and so on. And furthermore, I said the blueprint has to be pretty accurate. Like my house is not roughly, the rooms are not roughly a certain dimension. They would fall over. They're exact, and they match exactly the blueprint. The other approaches that I've looked for long days have gotten within a billion years here and there, but the Torah is very exact. Our laws are very exact. We know exactly what we have to do in Shabbos. Nothing's approximate. So that's where we went looking. So I'll give you the answer, and I'm going to keep going because people always get hung up on the math. I'll come back to the math at the end if you want, and I'm certainly available for the rest of the week. But I want to keep going with the flow. And the answer is that we need to take each of those days and say that things were not made 1 day old on that particular day, but they were made 1,000 times 7,000 times 365 days old. So on the first day was 2.5 billion, the second day was 2.5 billion, and so on. So as we count back from today, which is what we normally do, and the sixth day things were 2.5 billion years old. On the fifth day, they were 5 billion, made 5 billion years old. On the fourth day, they were made 7.5 billion years old, and so on. That's the conversion. The numbers are very simple. You see it's a 7 and a 1. The 365, of course, is just converting days to years, including the 0.25. They're very simple numbers. There's no fancy science numbers like 3.1415 and so on, just a 1 and a 7. And it's a single multiplication. You take every day and you just multiply it by that. Any mathematician on the room will tell you that the only way to, if you do that and you fudge it, you only get one right answer. As you'll see in a minute, I got 17. So we'll come back to those numbers if you're interested, but just note that they're very simple. So now we take all those sources that I told you about, where we know sometimes to the second, sometimes to 2/3 of an hour. That's the least accurate one, by the way, the moon, 2/3 of an hour. when everything was made, and we simply put it on an Excel spreadsheet. That is a fancy color version of my Excel spreadsheet, and multiply it all out. And we see what the Torah sources tell us how old things were made. How old was the universe made? How old was the sun made? How old was the moon made? Based on this formula of 7,000 times 1,000 times 365. So I did that. And on the third column here is the Torah answer. On the science fourth column is the same answers I showed you on the first slide, except that on the first slide I neglected to tell you that in science we don't know things exactly, we know a range. I just gave you the middle of the range in that slide. Here I'm giving you the whole range so you can appreciate the accuracy within which it is known in science. So, for example, if you go right back to the beginning, in the beginning, Bereshit bara, that is 13.743 billion years ago, and that matches exactly in the range. That data is about a month old, the science data. It's changing a little bit, but not very much. It's been pretty steady for about 5 years, around 13.7, 13.8. They're just bringing the error margin down as we go along. In the case of the sun, the Torah comes out with a number of 4.79 billion years, going back to day 4. And again, the scientific answer is a little bit skewed onto one side, but it includes that in the range. And so on you go. The beginning of life on day 5, let the waters teem. Every ocean in the earth shows fossils that instantly life appeared, microscopic life appeared on all the oceans, every single ocean. And the best date we have in science is 3.5 billion years ago. You use the formula, you convert it, you get 3.52 billion years ago. After that point is a huge mystery in science, but nothing happened for 3 billion years. Life stayed at the single, maximum 3-cell organisms. And then 500 million years ago, life exploded, including animals about this big, complex animals. That corresponds exactly with the Genesis account of the animals at 532 million years ago. It's unexplained by the theory of evolution. We'll get that in a minute because it happened too quickly. And all the way through, even plants. We know on day 6, it's saying God started planting the garden at this hour, stopped planting the garden at that hour, and that's exactly when trees and flowers and shrubs and so on appeared throughout to the minute. As I said, there are 17 things I was able to pull from our sources. Of course, science has millions, but I was able to pull 17, 16 fit within measurement error. 1 did not fit. I told you that most of the science dates that I'm using are derived from measurement, but some of them are derived from theory. The one that didn't fit comes from theory, not from a measurement. So the Torah gives a different answer. And presumably science will find the right answer sooner or later. So we have we go to the Torah, including the oral Torah, of course. We look for the exact dates. We multiply them by a very simple factor, which I haven't told you where it comes from yet. I apologize for that. And we get 16 points that line up. Now, any mathematician will tell you that if you're trying to fit points by a single multiplication, you can fit 1. And it would never fit with 7,000 times 1,000. It would probably come out to a fancier number than that. So quite an amazing fit. But the most interesting part of the story is yet to come. So now we've looked at the Torah, we've gotten these dates, we've converted them over. The blueprint's telling us that's how old things were made. Science is measuring that's how old things were made. and we have an agreement. But what about the how? The Torah keeps saying God spoke, God spoke, God spoke, God spoke, God said. And science has these two theories, being taught in all the schools, that it all happened naturally. How do we correlate that? And why is it that something so supernatural as God said and God said and God said could be possibly explained scientifically without any reference, to the point that they don't even acknowledge Hashem's existence? So we go back to the Torah, and we've got to go over two concepts. First of all, when you're reading any particular section, you will have noticed that there's different names used. God narrates in different names. And Rabbi Friedmann explained this yesterday also, but when you have an infinite being, you can't really describe him. That's why we say Hashem. But when that being is manifesting, you can describe what particular attribute of that being is manifested. So if I'm introduced as an engineer, you probably expect slides and tables and all kinds of good things. If I'm introduced as father, you might get a different talk from me, husband, and so on. So we also have many names, and depending on which name we're speaking in, we're kind of using that part of our intellect and emotions to communicate. The same is said of God. Whatever name is being narrated at gives us a hint on how we should try and understand that part of the Torah. Lucky for me, when I was working on this, I discovered that there's only one name in the first chapter of Genesis, because when I worked on Parshat Noah, I found two names, and they keep flipping back and forth. It gets confusing, hard work. But in Bereshit, it's just one name, and that name has many translations, but I love Rambam's translation the best. He says, Master of all forces. That name has the same numerical value as nature in Hebrew. That is the name that tells you that when Hashem is narrating under that name, he's saying, look, I have the power to do whatever I want, but I am choosing for this chapter to stick within the laws of nature. Of course, he created the laws of nature right at the beginning in Bereshit, but he's sticking with them. So he's not trying to violate the laws of nature. When you go to Parshat Noah, you find that in saving Noah, he does actually perform what we call a miracle, which is to go outside of nature. But in this Parsha, he is sticking within nature. So what he's telling us is that everything that I am doing in the creation, I am obeying the laws of nature. I just chose to obey the laws of nature. That's point number one. Point number two, if you go through the language of the creation narrative, our sages have been very clear to point out where the language means that he is taking something that already exists and making something else, as we would when we cook. We take, not that I'm a good cook, but we take several ingredients and we make something else. Or we take wood and we make a chair. Or God takes hydrogen and he makes a star. So he's taking something and making something else. And they also point out that there's only three places, just three places, where God does not take something, but he goes from nothing, what we call nothing, nothing physical, only spiritual. And that's when he uses the word bara, which is translated as a creation ex nihilo. So if we just put aside those three for a minute, and you put these two concepts together, he's saying, I am sticking with the laws of nature, and I'm taking something into something else. Now, if you check the Webster definition on Google of science and the scientific method, that's it. It's explaining how something became something else under a law of nature, and of course science goes to try and discover the law of nature, so they go and discover gravity and the nuclear forces and so on. So what he's telling us is that I'm taking something to something else under the laws of nature. Therefore, if you use a scientific method, which is there to discover how something changes to something else under a law of nature, you're going to get it right. It's telling us right there that when scientists do what they've been doing for the last couple hundred years, they're going to get that perfect answer. They're going to get the right answer. They're going to think it's all natural. They're going to think there's no God. They're going to be completely fooled. And they're going to get the right answer. But he left three clues in the crime scene, as you would say, the three baras. So I explained that these measurements are coming from straightforward measurements, but science has built up the theory of evolution and the Big Bang theory to explain the measurements. And what's not well explained in the literature is that there are four very large problems with those theories today. Four places where science really doesn't have the answer. One of those, they're pretty convinced they're going to have the answer in the next 10 years. But three of them keep getting worse. Now, what do I mean by keep getting worse? That in science, as you get more information, you expect to get to a better and better answer. But in these particular three cases, they're getting to a worse answer. In other words, the answer seems more and more elusive. And those three events correspond exactly in time, nature, and name to the three baras when we correlate all this. So the Torah is saying you're going to figure everything out except three things. We figured everything out except three things. Science still thinks they're going to figure out those three things, but the Torah is predicting they'll never figure it out because the scientific method can't deal with nothing. It has to start from somewhere, something has to already exist. So I'll give you one example today, and my talk tomorrow I'm going to go over this for the human piece of the story only, which is a little bit more complex than what we talked about today, which is another example. But the best example, which I think most people are aware of, is the second word in Genesis, the Reshit bara. The first bara appears right at the beginning. And of course, it means that the beginning, that means time, space, and the elementary particles from which the world is made, that was from nothing. And when you look at the Big Bang theory, it explains everything. It reproduces the universe beautifully, exactly what we observe, just by running Einstein's equations. But the only way you can reproduce the universe by running Einstein's equations is you have to tell the computer 26 numbers at the very beginning. You have to tell them the force of gravity, how big is the force of gravity. You have to tell them what the mass of a proton is. You have to tell them what the mass of a neutron is. You have to tell them what the electromagnetic force is. 26 things you have to tell the computer, and then the Big Bang theory reproduces the universe in the computer. And nobody has a clue why those 26 things, or why they have the value they do. They're all measured. They're just extracted from out there. And if you vary any one of those 26 numbers by about 1%, nothing works. It's called in science the fine-tuning problem. In Torah, we call it bara, creation out of nothing. So even though we have an incredibly successful theory, which, as explained in Genesis, over the first 4 days, God is making things one from the other, according to the laws of nature, just like the theory says, the theory completely fails at the beginning and has no answer. You may have heard of the multiverse and all kinds of things. There's no scientific consensus on that at all. It's complete science fiction at the moment. And it's untestable, so it can never become science. So, in conclusion, we have a very rich, not thousands of pages like in science, but certainly hundreds of pages on creation. Kabbalah in particular, Hasidut in particular, has a tremendous amount of information on it, rivals anything in science, although that's not the purpose of the Torah, it's still there. When we stick only to what happened and when it happened, we take all the house out of the picture and we align it with science based on those couple of numbers, we get the same answers, and they make sense in the context of a 6,000-year-old universe in which things were made in the ready-made state. Just like Adam was made 20 years old, so was the sun made ready to go. In fact, that's why I said it was good. All the way through the 6 days. It became useful to man. And then we go back to the how, The Torah is very clear that science is going to be incredibly successful. Don't be surprised. Don't be shocked that they got the right answer. But there's 3 places where you will find Hashem because he did it out of nothing and science can't figure it out. And the Kabbalah, by the way, explains it, which is the subject of my next book, but that's not written yet. So I'd be happy to take questions. All this is written down in a book where every statement is referenced to a Torah source or a peer-reviewed science. So there's almost as many pages of references as there is of text. They're in the back if you want to get one. Yes, please.
I had a discussion one time with a rabbi on subjects like this, especially concerning issues of timeline, and argued the possibility that there may not be much a real discrepancy between science and Torah, in that the numbers don't necessarily line up one for one, especially with regards to time itself. For example, hours and days, that the time in Torah of an hour a day may not be specifically the same as what science calls an hour and a day, that these may not be exactly the same. In terms of maybe a day was not 24 hours at the time of creation, but something other, as you seem to indicate that there were the timelines themselves don't, as indicated by your spreadsheet that you had up. But the rabbi insisted, no, that they are the same, that a day was 24 hours and the year was 365 days and so forth, that it was one for one and there was no discrepancy. Science has the problem, he insisted, not Torah. So what's your explanation of what appears to be a discrepancy?
Sure. So, as I explained, the majority opinion, and that's why your rabbi said that, is that the 6 creation days were 24-hour days. They were 5,777 years ago, and that's it. So it's not my explanation. It's the Rebbe's explanation is that things were made in ready-made state. They were made complete. So when the sun was made, it was made ready to go. It wasn't a science trying to extrapolate backwards, imagines that a bunch of hydrogen was more dense in one place, and because of the force of gravity, the hydrogen contracted and became a star, and that process takes a long time. The same with Adam. He wasn't a baby, he was made a 20-year-old. So the Rebbe's explanation is, yes, there's 6 24-hour days, they're 5,777 years ago, but everything was made in its ready-made state. So then I just go look to the blueprint and tell me how old it was made, because it's the blueprint. It's got to tell me. Like when I make an antique home from a blueprint, it tells me to put the copper in and make sure that the copper roof has been in the, looks like it's been in the rain for 20 years. So that's the approach. They were made old, and we can check how old they were made, but it's 6 24-hour days, as your rabbi said. That's the majority opinion. That's not all the opinions, but the majority opinion. Yes?
Yeah, truly, it is fascinating how it does all line up with the same multiplication for each day, the 7,000 by 100. But I was just wondering if you could explain, besides, I guess, a matter of the fact that it could just be come up with, hang on, these numbers, if we all multiply them by these numbers, it actually works. Was there any other logic behind getting to those numbers specifically?
Yeah, absolutely. I went looking for the numbers in the blueprint. I'm not very happy to reverse engineer the blueprint. And as I mentioned, if you just take one of these numbers, like the 6 days versus 13 billion years, and you make that fit, you would get a multiplier. But that might not work for the sun and the moon and everything else. In fact, mathematically, it shouldn't work. So it all works. So I went looking for the numbers in the blueprint, and it's a bit of a longer story, but I'll give you the quick version of it. And the quick version is that there's this notion that prior to Adam, the way that time is calculated to make these things is different, because he's not keeping the time, God's keeping the time. God has different worlds and stratas that he works in. At the top level, there is no time. He is past, present, and future. Everything's the same. There's no existence of time. So when you work through that, we have certain numbers in Torah. For example, we're told that one day for God is 1,000 of our years. That's Psalms. That's in the Shacharit's prayer on Saturday, on Shabbos. Check it out this Saturday. So that's where the 1,000 and the 365 and this formula come from. The 7,000 is a little bit more complicated, but it comes from a commentary on Rabbi Isaac Luria's work, which we follow now on Kabbalah, which explains that each of the days come from the Sfirot, if you've heard about the concept of Sfirot, and that there is time within the Sfirot, but it's different in different worlds. And without confusing everybody, you get to a 7,000 for that day. So you take the 7,000, and then prior to Adam, you also multiply it by the one day for God is 1,000 of our years, so you multiply by 1,000 and 365. So that's where those numbers come from. If you had reversed engineer it, not only it wouldn't work for everything, but you'd never get to 7,000 and 1,000. Right? You might get to 7,142.35. I mean, we're fitting these numbers to amazing accuracy, right? We're third decimal place. They all fit except the one within the scientific measurement. Sorry, we'll come back to you in 1 second. The question was, what's the one that doesn't fit? That's the funnest part of the whole story. The one that doesn't fit is the one that started all the trouble, the Earth. Because it was people digging around the Earth that discovered that the Earth was old. And in Torah, the Earth is day 3. The sun and the moon are day 4, to remind you. The planet Earth, as opposed to Eretz and day 1, which is the whole universe. Yeah, we're good. So, in science, we can measure the age of the sun very, very accurately. We have pointed a pile of satellites to the sun, and the way we measure the age of the sun is just like the gene problem. We know the nuclear reaction is converting hydrogen to helium and releasing energy. And we can tell exactly how much hydrogen and helium is there today. And we know exactly how long each reaction to turn every 2 hydrogens into helium takes, because we can do it on Earth. Unfortunately, we did it for the wrong reasons, but we can do it on Earth. And therefore, on the assumption that it started with all hydrogen, it's been 4.5 billion years. And that's how we measure it. Again, if God made it, he would have made it half hydrogen, half helium already, and it wouldn't be 4.5 billion. So, similarly with the moon, we've been there, we got the rocks, we brought them back. Now, when it comes to Earth, there's nothing left on Earth that's original. Every rock on Earth has been through volcanism, plate tectonics, erosion. You wouldn't know it here, but if you lived in Vancouver, you know the rocks don't last very long. Lots of rain. So scientists have not found a single original rock. So they're unable to measure the Earth. What they conjecture is that the Earth was made at the same time as the sun and the moon. And therefore, it's 4.5 billion years old. But the Torah says, no, it's a day older than that. And by this formula, it's 2.5 billion years older. So it's out by a lot. But the Earth is one, I think it's the only one in that table that's not a measurement, it's an extrapolation from something. Everything else is counting some kind of a clock, nuclear reactions, hydrogen to helium, and so on. Some kind of internal clock they're counting. Yes, sir.
Yes, you know Adam naming the animals as between 426, 320 million years ago, and use that to correspond to the scientific dating of four-legged animals, herbivores, and so on appearing. But if Adam's naming the animals, doesn't that mean that humans, this indicates that humans appeared 320 to 426 million years ago, and science seems to think that even the nearest ancestors of humanoids only appeared several million to maybe 10 million years ago. So how do we reconcile that?
Right, so that's very good. I hear there's a really good talk tomorrow around 11:30
Right during my presentation.
Your presentation, okay. I'll give you the short answer. The Adam that we know and love pre-sin, according to all the Torah sources, didn't look like you and me. He was a divine being with completely different, his body was like glass, so his soul shone right through it. He had huge intellect and so on and so forth. And he was a partner with God on day 6. And one of the things he did was he named the animals, and that corresponds. The guy that people are finding in the bones, he's like you and me. That is post-sin.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes.
I was wondering, is your work an extension of what Dr. Gerald Schroeder wrote? He wrote The Science of God. Is this an extension of that? Do you have similar findings that he found?
It's a lot of his books. I read all his books. It's a different approach, and it's in agreement with the days being 6 24-hour days and so on. I had some things that I couldn't reconcile in my mind from his approach, but we're in the same business.
Okay.
And
he's different way of doing
saving
things.
he's saving people. If you like his books, fantastic.
Okay.
I needed to do some more work. Thank you.
How do you know that the days till day 4 were actually 12 and 12 hours? Because it says, Erev Vayi Boker, if the sun and moon were not created till the day 4th, how do you know that it was really 24 hours a day?
Sure. So there's this concept that, if God's making the world, he doesn't need the sun to tell him when 24 hours are up. I mean, he knew what 24 hours was before he made the sun.
But why does it say Vayi Erev Vayi Boker? There were no Erev, no Boker.
Yeah, but he knew the whole design.
Of course.
The sun was put there for us. So I'm not the guy that came up with it. This is our sources. Almost everybody agrees that those were 6 24-hour days, the same as today. That's what our sages have come to the conclusion over.
The other question was related to this one. Years ago, people believed that the world is flat. And only later on, we realized, it's actually round. So how do you know that the method of measuring the carbon time is actually the right method? Maybe for what we see now is right, but for what used to be, it was different.
Yeah, and first of all, you have to separate measurement from theory. The theory was there was no measurement. The theory was that the world was flat. In fact, the theory in physics was that the universe was eternal. Mm-hmm. When the Torah had been saying for thousands of years it had a beginning and had it right, even Einstein believed the world was eternal, and it changed his own equations. But you have to separate theory from measurement. Once we went up on a satellite and looked down and saw a ball, we knew it was round. Are these dating methods correct or not? They're being refined all the time. The numbers I'm showing you here, 30 years ago, the number was 12 to 25 billion. Today is, whatever I put down there, they're being refined. Are there errors? Yes. But by and large, the whole thing is pretty congruent for the last little while, and it's not changing that much. So when you look at science, you have to separate measurement from theory. The theories keep getting made, and we will find that the theory will get...
There may be a big difference, because if the methods is not right and the theory is not right, then how do we know?
Yeah, well, to the best of our knowledge, there's 3 different methods being used, and they're all being pretty congruent. In any case, they're not coming up. There's no method that's coming up with 6,000, right? They're all coming up with billions.
Yeah, right. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, happening for a long time.
Forgive my interest in Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. It might be pertinent here. My recollection is that in Genesis 1, on day 3, there was green vegetation. And I think what you've got here is that there's as in your slide, trees, flowers, and plants are on day 6. Now that's, my recollection is that's in Genesis 2.
Correct. Yeah.
So, along with what I'm asking, how do you resolve that, if it is a discrepancy? Is it the consensus of opinion that what happened in Genesis 2 was on day 6? Or how do we know that what happens in Genesis 2 is in a particular day?
Well, there's two separate questions. First of all, Genesis 2 is an elaboration of Genesis 1. So Genesis 1 is the whole story, then we go back and we work through man.
So is Genesis 2 all 6 days?
No, just the last. It's all about Adam and the day 6, all the stuff that happened in day 6,
okay.
And the planting of the garden in day 6. But your main question, the general understanding is that the 6 days correspond to the 6 sephirot of our emotions, and the first 3 are parallel to the last 3. And in the first 3, you create the potential and the general things, and in the last 3, you create the real things. So, for example, in day 1, we have let there be light. Well, that's not the sun. That's electromagnetic radiation. That's a potential for light. In day 4, which parallels day 1, we have the sun. So most of the commentaries, not all, say that the day 3 plants that you read about were the potential for plants, and Rashi specifically says they didn't rise above the ground. In other words, the potential was there for them to sprout, but it was not till day 6, till Adam prayed, that the plants rose. Now, when we measure the fossil record, I got to go back to science. I measure dead plants. We don't measure live plants in science, right? We measure fossilized plants. So I need the plants to grow and die. And most of the commentaries are saying that that did not happen in day 3. That didn't happen until day 6. So that's why I put the day 6 dates from Genesis 2.
Just one more thing. Can you give us an example where from a source that you derive that the plants and trees, flowers came on the scene those particular millions of years? Where does that come from?
This particular thing comes from that quote in the Talmud, which I the second quote there from the Talmud. We're done. So, yeah, I'm just answering the last question before you clap. Comes from that quote. That's not the full quote, but that quote goes on to say exactly when God started planting the garden and when He stopped planting the garden. It tells us that time, and that's the range that I put in the other slide. And when I convert it through, all the plants start appearing in that sequence exactly in those 3 hours. That's where that comes from. All of these are referenced in my book. Thank you. I'm happy to answer more questions outside.
Thank you very much.